Okay, in this special lecture for lab, we're going to go over the heart. What should you know about the heart? For heart lab, we're going to dissect a cat and look at the thorax. We're going to look into the mediastinum. We're going to cut the heart out, examine major blood vessels, notice and locate the diaphragm, and that'll be the end of lab. Before that, we're going to go through and look at some illustrations of the heart wall, the location of the heart in the chest. You need to know the histology and anatomy of a heart. You need to know that it's a four-chambered structure. Upper two chambers being atrium, lower two chambers being ventricles. You're going to need to know the major blood vessels. You're going to need to know the coronary blood vessels. You're going to need to know the anatomy and physiology of a heart valve and the histology. And lastly, you'll have to know the pathway of blood through the heart, beginning at any location and working your way back to that location in the circulatory system or cycle. You should know that there's going to be oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. Veins are colored blue typically. Arteries are colored red typically. Pulmonary circulation, it's opposite. So when we look at what do you need to know as a student, you need to know the anatomy, the physiology of everything. Some of that will be covered in lab. The heavier phys will be covered in lecture. The EKG would be covered in lecture. You have to know pathway of blood flow both for lecture and lab. You should know the histology of heart muscle. Heart muscle is called cardiac muscle. It's striated, it's branching, it's irregular. You have single nuclei. There are structures called intercalated discs. I'll show you a picture of heart muscle in just a second. As far as hormones and neurotransmitters, you should remember the two autonomic transmitters, which were epinephrine and acetylcholine. Remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine are sympathetic substances. Acetylcholine at the heart is parasympathetic. So the epinephrine, norepinephrine increase blood pressure, increase contractility of the heart, affect the dynamics of blood vessels. On the other side, the parasympathetic, which would be vagus, the vagus nerve was Roman numeral 10, if you remember. That would slow your heart, and it slows your heart by releasing acetylcholine. As far as the heart hormone goes, you should know that we're going to know that the heart responds when there's too much volume or stretch of the ventricles. When we have high blood pressure, the heart responds by producing a substance called ANP, called atrial natriuretic peptide. And you'll understand that the heart produced it, you'll understand what its effects are on your overall physiology. And lastly, you should know the developmental aspects of the heart. You should know the imbalances related to heart, some of the complications with heart disease and heart attacks. You should also know the relationship of arteries and veins to the heart, what chambers are associated with outgoing blood or returning blood. You should know the color code system that you're going to need to know if you're looking at a pulmonary vessel, that the colors are opposite because the heart is pumping blood away to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Therefore, those arteries are going to appear blue, while the veins that are returning from the lungs to the heart are going to be red because they're oxygen rich. So when you look at just a general picture of heart here, ignoring the labels because I'm going to go through it with you, we're looking at the anterior of the heart. When we look at someone's heart at the anterior, this would be like you're looking inside the chest of another person. The heart points down into their left side. This point of the heart is called the apex. You'll notice the difference in coloration here. You got some yellow, that would be adipose tissue. You have this red muscular looking structure, these would be the ventricles. While these bluish purple colored structures here would be the atrium. Atrium is singular, atria is plural. You can see a left and a right atria in this picture. The atria have these little flap-like structures. Those are called auricles. I don't see that labeled here, so I'm telling you. The word auricle means a little flap like an ear. So that's the anterior external anatomy. You can see the coronary vessels in this picture. In this case, she doesn't show you, or this is a generic picture that's public domain. This isn't from your textbook, but it's similar enough that you should be able to look at your own textbook picture and pick out for yourself that where my cursor is sitting, that's a coronary, and it's a coronary artery. Okay, all the vessels on the heart here are arteries that that the picture illustrates. We're gonna get to the coronaries toward the end. So in blue color here, you can see this large vessel in blue. This is the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery, but we call it the pulmonary trunk. It splits into left and right pulmonary arteries. So your left lung would be sitting on this side of the screen and your right lung would be sitting on this side of the screen. You can see red and blue vessels here. The red blood vessels would be blood that's returning and it's oxygen rich. That's why it's colored red. The largest artery in the human body is this one that you see curling over. This is your aorta, and this specifically is called the aortic arch. Down here, as blood is pumped and forced out of the heart, this would be your ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, and then it wraps back around and goes behind the heart. That would be the descending aorta. And sometimes we put an extra tag on it. If it's in the thorax, we call it a thoracic aorta. And if it's below the diaphragm, we call it an abdominal aorta. If you ever heard of a AAA, abdominal aortic aneurysm, that's what that means. Notice at the top of the aortic arch, 3 major vessels that you should know. The first one here that branches off is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Then you have 2 more vessels. The one in the middle here would be the left common carotid artery. And to the right here, your right, but the patient's left, this would be the left subclavian artery. And subclavian tells you it's going to be below the clavicle, which means it's going to go towards your left upper extremity and eventually change names several times that you'll learn about in a later lab. Back to this brachiocephalic trunk, which is the first branch at the top of the aortic arch. It would, if we saw it far enough up, it would split and branch off into a right common carotid artery and a right subclavian that would wrap behind these vein structures you see in the picture. The largest veins in diameter are the inferior and superior vena cava. The actual largest vessel in diameter is your inferior vena cava, largest in diameter. The inferior vena cava carries blood from the lower extremity and any structure below the heart. That would include your viscera. The blood returning from your head, neck, upper thorax, upper extremities would be the superior vena cava. And not illustrated here, this would be for a different time. These are called brachiocephalic veins. So there would be a right and a left. Back to the coronaries real quick, which I said I'll tell you more about later. Only illustrated is the arteries, but there would be most of the time veins that would be running parallel, okay, with the arteries. So we're on the left side here. This would be back here behind the atrium would be a left coronary artery, which branches into the circumflex and the anterior descending artery. Okay. Ignore this left marginal. I'm not going to teach you that. The marginal is going to be associated with the right coronary artery. You can see that it's coming out just underneath this flap called an auricle of the right atrium. The right coronary becomes the marginal, and on the other side of the heart that you can't see in this picture, it would be the posterior descending artery. And these have different names depending on what cardiologist or hospital you might work in. You're going to need to know for quiz and test purposes the ones that are in the book, the names used in the book. You look at some other anatomical pictures than what your textbook offers. Reminder, I'm testing you from textbook pictures, but you should be able to know what you're looking at in any illustration. These are a couple Gray's Anatomy pictures here, and again I've highlighted in yellow to indicate that they're open source or public domain free pictures. So inside the chest, above the diaphragm, is a pericardial sac which surrounds the heart. Again, the heart lies in the mediastinum. You can see yellow to represent nerves, so this would be the vagus nerves or phrenic nerves that you're seeing in this picture. You're not going to get tested on that here. You will know, however, that the heart is controlled by the vagus nerve. So this is just a couple different perspectives that the heart lies in the mediastinum between the two lungs. In the bottom picture, you'll notice that we're looking at a cross-section through the thorax. The heart again lies in the mediastinum. Each lung lies in their own pleural cavity. So there are going to be serous membranes here, and you should remember from Part 1 anatomy when we went through histology that simple squamous epithelium forms serous membranes. However, when it comes to the heart, the outer sac is referred to as a parietal pericardium, which means it's going to be the outside, and it is going to be more rigid and a tougher tissue made of dense, irregular connective tissue. So back to looking at this cross section, you can see the heart lying between the lungs, behind the sternum. The word behind would be posterior, anterior to the spine, and between or medial to the right and left lungs. You can see at the top here the cut aorta. You can see the superior vena cava and pulmonary trunks. Okay, superior vena cava is over there. Here's your pulmonary trunk. So just giving you some perspective of where the heart is in the chest cavity. The heart is deep in the chest, but if you're asked, it's posterior to the sternum. Internal heart anatomy, real quick. Again, you know that there's a four-chambered heart. The top chambers are referred to plural as atria. Atria have auricles. The bottom two chambers, or inferior chambers, are known as ventricles. Notice you can see this irregular bands of muscle in the wall of the heart. Those are called trabeculae carnae, okay, and they're labeled down here in this bottom picture. Trabeculae carnae are the irregular bands of muscle that you would see in ventricles only. Up in the atria, you see bands of muscle which are referred to as pectinate muscle. This is all testable. The valves appear white in the picture. You see 3 of the 4. There's another one here saying that it's open because you can see an arrow running behind the pulmonary trunk. Name the 4 vessels here real quick for you. You have 2 that are larger and 2 that are smaller. The 2 larger are going to be called AV valves, with the one on the left specifically called bicuspid or mitral. And on the right side, you're going to have the tricuspid valve. And knowing the name bicuspid and tricuspid, the word cusp essentially means a flap-like structure. So there are 2 flaps to the bicuspid and 3 flaps that come together to close when we have the tricuspid valves. The 2 semilunar valves, of which only one of them is visible, they're also a tricuspid valve, but you don't call them tricuspid. You name them for what they're called. The one in the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, and the one that's within the aorta, specifically the ascending aorta, is called the aortic semilunar valve. So there's a real quick 4 valves of the heart and 4 chambers to the heart. What's the anatomy of the valve? The valve is made of, again, dense, irregular connective tissue, and you should look back wisely back to the histology pictures, because those histo pictures can come back on quizzes, and you are expected to remember that, and there's a building upon prior knowledge here. Another observation to make for you here. Notice the left side of the heart wall. Notice the right side of the heart heart wall. The right side is thinner than the left. Why would that be? Because the left side of the heart pumps blood through your aorta to your entire body. So there's a greater resistance and a larger force needed in order to pump that blood against resistance. If you're pumping blood to your head and your toes, you need a lot of force, and that force is going to come from that thick left ventricular wall. Where does the blood from this right ventricle go? It goes into the pulmonary trunk and arteries to the lungs nearby. So we don't need quite as much muscle to the right ventricle for that reason, thus the thinner wall. The wall that divides the heart from right and left sides again, the patient's left and the right side of the patient here. The wall that divides right from left is called the septum. So if we're between the two ventricles, we call it an interventricular septum, and if it's between the two atria, we call it an interatrial septum. Again, this is going to be heaviest on anatomy, and the physiology will come again later in the lecture. Although you should know, what is the purpose of a valve that I just mentioned? The purpose of valves is to prevent backflow of blood. And you can look at this figure to see arrows indicating flow. I've gone through the major vessels of the heart in the pictures. These are the major vessels that you will know on your second lab quiz. We have an aorta, which has three parts. There's an ascending aorta, that's what comes out of the left ventricle. In the ascending aorta is where you would find your aortic semilunar valve. Next up, you have the aortic arch, which has three branches at its top. The first of those three is the brachiocephalic trunk. The second of those three is the left common carotid. And the last of those three is the left subclavian artery. Reminder, brachiocephalic trunk will divide into a right common carotid and right subclavian artery. After the aorta curls over and goes behind the heart or posterior, we call that the descending aorta, of which we can further classify it as being thoracic and abdominal. The difference between thorax and abdomen was a structure. The diaphragm divides the ventral body cavity into thoracic and abdominal cavities. Also colored red at the bottom. Why? Because it's oxygen-rich blood that would be returning from the lungs to the heart. The term vein and artery have been used, and at this point you should know what an artery and a vein do. Arteries always carry blood away. Veins always carry blood back to the heart. On the blue side of the screen there, you can see the two largest veins of the body, which are the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Asterisk on the inferior, it is the largest vessel in diameter in the human body. It's lumen, it's opening. The word L-U-M-E-N, lumen, means opening of a hollow organ. Blood vessels are organs. What was the definition of an organ from part 1? A structure that has two or more tissues. I'll get to the anatomy of a blood vessel before I wrap this up. So we have a pulmonary trunk as well. That blood is pumped from the right ventricle, enters pulmonary arteries, and goes to the respective lung. If we look at the anatomy of the heart and heart wall, three terms that you should know of the heart wall. They're referred to as epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. And epi means on top of or on the outside. Myo indicates that it's muscle, so this would be the location of cardiac muscle, from which you should remember from chapter 4. And endocardium would be the inner lining of the chambers of the heart, and that's going to be composed of an epithelium, simple squamous epithelium, and we're going to specifically know it as endothelium. Endothelium would be the inside of a heart. Got a heart here. You can see it if I get close enough and show it to you. You can see that the inside there is a thin layer of pink, and you can see the thicker layer in red to indicate the muscle or the muscular layer, which would be the myocardium. That would be continuous with the blood vessel. And I've got a model here that's got different levels of plaquing and cardiovascular disease. But if I show you this circle on end here, you can see that there are three layers. The inner layer is a lighter colored pink. You have a thicker red layer, and then another layer that's a pinkish color. The three layers of the blood vessel, you're not going to worry about now, but the outside would be called a tunica externa. That middle layer that's red would be smooth muscle, and the inside layer, labeled in a very light pink or white color, would be the tunica intima or interna, which is continuous with the heart's endocardium. So you have a smooth, slick inner surface to the chambers of the heart, which is continuous with the vessels and vascular system. Now those are the three layers of the heart or heart wall if you have to identify them from superficial to deep or from inside out. You should know a synonymous term with endocardium would be referring to the outside of the heart as the pericardium. Remember the pericardium, we refer to that as a sac-like structure. This figure here on the left is the one I actually prefer a little more for illustrating the pericardium to you. You'll notice this is in a different language. Unimportant because I'm labeling it with you and explaining it to you. So the outside again is going to be a sac that holds the heart. The inside middle layer is the thickest layer of the heart. That's the cardiac muscle. The myocardium is the thickest part of the heart. If you've heard of a heart attack before, by its fancy name, it's called a myocardial infarction. Infarction means death of this tissue or this layer. And the inside layer, which you see as a whiter, a thin pink line, is the endocardium, which is that simple squamous epithelium. Again, another picture, different source, illustrating the same thing. The inner layer, you can see the branching, irregular nature, which should look similar enough to you from when you did histology. You can see these darker bands, which would be called intercalated discs. You got endocardium on the inside, epicardium on the outside. Another name or synonymous term for epicardium is visceral pericardium. The outside, which is going to contain that dense regular connective tissue, is called parietal pericardium. In between the two pericardial layers, you'd have a thin fluid called serous fluid, and that would lubricate those two pericardial surfaces so that every time the heart beats, you're going to get rubbing of these two layers over one another. The purpose of serous fluid is to reduce friction. So this rather crappy picture that I found on the internet, open source, once again, is branching and irregular. You can see these irregular bands of tissue in between heart cells. Those are called intercalated discs. You can see that they have a nucleus. These cells are branching in nature or irregular. And remember, they're striated. The bottom, again, rather crappy pictures. Your book's got much better pictures to see. I'll see if I can find one of those in a second here. You got a branching, irregular nature to cardiac muscle, while you have cylinders that run parallel, if you recall, from skeletal. Skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles are striated in nature, which means they had that overlapping actin and myosin filaments. A bands and I bands, if you remember that fun from part 1. So I've already explained most of this to you, and to see some written material. You've got upper chambers that are superior, they're called atria. You have inferior chambers that are called ventricles. You have irregular bands of muscle in the ventricles called trabeculae carnae, and in the atria you have pectinate muscle. You have a septum, which means wall, that runs down the middle of the heart, dividing the left side into the oxygen-rich blood side of the heart, while the right side is lower in oxygen, so we call it oxygen poor. It is not absent of oxygen. In fact, there's lots of oxygen present, just less than what the arteries hold. This Gray's Anatomy figure shows you that you have three valves that have three cusps, one of them actually being called tricuspid, one of them found in the aorta called the aortic semilunar valve, and the one in the pulmonary trunk called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Semilunar valves are smaller than AV valves. One of the AV valves has two cusps, one of the AV valves has three cusps. You can notice that the AV valves are larger than the illustrated smaller semilunar. Again, all valves' purpose functionally is to prevent backflow of blood, and they're made of dense irregular connective tissue. The pathway of blood through the heart. I've got a list here that you want to know and not just memorize, because I can ask you to start in any one place and come back around to that one place. So just because I start with vena cava, which was made generic, I don't say superior or inferior here, but you will eventually be able to identify both. In this case, you would start with vena cava and be able to trace your way all the way through, returning to the vena cava. I could give you a different landmark and say you're in a pulmonary vein. Where are you going to next? Where did you just come from? So I do not expect you to name off the entire body. I just said body. The aorta delivers blood into smaller and smaller arteries until you get to some named specific body part, and then we return through the venous system back to the heart. Your book and these open source pictures try and generically label this for you, saying, notice the red to indicate oxygen rich, the blue to indicate oxygen poor. Again, I showed you a picture earlier that showed you that the left side of the heart is oxygen rich while the right side is oxygen poor. On to the coronary vessels and circulation. I asked two major questions at the bottom. At the top, I tell you that you should know that you will have to identify from the pictures of the text and on our models certain vessels. If I hold one up again, right here down the middle of the front of the heart, this is the anterior view. That is the posterior view. They look very different. Down the midline here of this heart, we have an artery in red that is descending. This is called the anterior descending artery. Okay. There might be a couple other synonyms that I use here shortly. I'm going to test you on, again, more of what the manual and the book say than what I just called it. And you can see that you have blue veins that run as well with the arteries, with the largest blue coronary vessel, where my finger is there, called the coronary sinus. And that's a key landmark that you want to know. If you can see that, you're looking at the posterior of the heart. All blue vessels are going to feed into that coronary sinus and then enter the heart. Notice that's the question at the bottom of the screen that you're left to think about and answer. And I say that coronary arteries originate from what? And I'm going to leave that as a question that you think about yourself before coming to lab. When you read your own textbook, that information should be revealed to you. Second bullet at the top there, it says explain what these coronary vessels are serving or draining. It's the myocardium, the muscular layer of the heart. Notice their location. They're on the outside of the heart because you don't want them inside, because every time the heart contracts, you would compromise blood flow to the myocardium. So the coronary arteries up first. You should know that the textbook pictures are excellent and you should refer to them. And I'll point those out to you in lecture and in lab. So what do you need to know when it comes to coronary arteries for a lab quiz and midterm? You need to know you have a left and a right coronary artery, each of which has two major branches. There are a lot more. I'm not going to make you know any more than the 6 you see on the screen. You have a right coronary artery, which branches into marginal and posterior interventricular. And that's what happens to be illustrated in this picture. RCA indicates right coronary artery. You can see there's a major blood vessel right here that it's coming off of. So the coronaries are in fact the first arteries to branch off of your aorta. You can see that it comes around the right side margin of the heart, therefore we call that marginal. And on the back side of the heart, not illustrated, you would find down the back side of the heart a coronary artery in this sulcus of the heart, this groove, and that would be the posterior descending or interventricular artery. LAD stands for left anterior descending. Okay, that's also known as the left anterior interventricular, and that's what's collectively or sometimes referred to as the widowmaker, because in this lower picture you see this dark red spot indicating there's an area of damage or infarct from a compromise of blood flow, i.e. a heart attack. That's a myocardial infarction right there. And notice as well, I said that the left side of the heart is thicker in the ventricles than the right side. Okay, you can see this white space. Your heart holds the same volume of blood in each of these two chambers. Okay, so it looks a little deceiving, but we would have the same volume in the space on the left as we would on the right, and that should only make sense. If you're pumping a given unit of blood, you're pumping it in a circle from each of the four chambers and then out to the heart, out of the heart to the body, and return that volume back into the chambers of the heart again. I said there were four chambers to the heart, and your book has a picture that I'm going to have you know for lab quiz purposes as well. Again, the four valves were your pulmonary semilunar, your aortic semilunar, your tricuspid, and your bicuspid. And at the bottom here of the screen here, I point out to you that there are two unique features to AV valves only, and I'll illustrate that on a model here real quick. You can see the inside, there is a white valve here with little strings that go up to the cusp. Okay, those are referred to on the screen as the chordae tendineae, and they would attach to little knobs of muscle, as you can see in this heart model at my index finger. Those are called papillary muscles, so you would be able to identify those from models and figures. So what you want to look for and know as well then is there are 5 colored dots on this thorax or rib cage. Notice that we're looking at the first and second intercostal space. So you have a blue dot and a yellow dot on the left and right second intercostal spaces. And you're going to disregard this picture. I just realized it's not very accurate. That's the trouble you get from an open source picture. I'll talk more about that in lab using your textbook figure. On to fetal adult structures. You can see there are 2 structures listed on the left side of the screen. One called the foramen, which means opening, and it's oval, so foramen ovale. On the left side as well, you see a structure called the ductus arteriosus. So foramen ovale and ductus arteriosus are fetal structures. Notice on the right side of the screen you can see what those fetal structures become in the adult. All of us being adults and normal would have a fossa ovalis and a ligamentum arteriosum. And this model crudely illustrates a white spot right there between the pulmonary trunk and aortic arch, and that's called the ligamentum arteriosum, which is going to be listed in the anterior picture in your book. Depending on the edition of your textbook, the newest edition, and this is going to date this video, but when you look in the textbook and in the pregnancy, human growth and development chapter, you can see those fetal to adult comparison pictures, which will be testable both on the heart quiz and midterm. Now, which I'd like you to think about for a quick second is when you look at fetal structures, What is the purpose of having a hole in your heart wall? That's what the ductus arteriosus and foramen ovale are. Foramen ovale would be an oval hole in the wall of the heart, while the ductus arteriosus is a shunt that allows blood to go from the pulmonary trunk into the aortic arch of the fetus. Why does a fetus have these structures? Because what does a fetus not do for itself? Breathe. Your mom breathes for you. Okay, so the gas exchange is occurring in mom's lungs. So you would think about that and think about the importance of a well-developed formed placenta, because the oxygen-rich blood and nutrient-rich blood is going to come from the mother through the fetus. And again, we're bypassing the fetal lungs because they're not developed yet. That's one of the big deals of why it's a life-threatening situation, is to be born premature, because your lungs are not ready to breathe yet and develop, which is why they might be put into a little chamber until their lungs are functional. You got 4 veins that I'm going to have you know as coronary veins. I pointed out to you that the largest coronary vessel on the back side of the heart is called the coronary sinus. Okay, and there are going to be 3 veins that feed into that. You can see this open source Gray's Anatomy picture points out to you that you have the middle cardiac, which is lying on the posterior of the heart. You're going to have, not seen in this picture, a small small cardiac and a great cardiac that you can see going toward the front. So the great cardiac is going to lie on the anterior surface. You can see on the posterior surface of the heart we have our middle cardiac vein, and the small is going off in this direction in the figure. And I'll let you look those over on a model when you're in lab. So 2 quick clinical points. I don't have a myocardium slide apparently set up. I should have. I'll save it for lecture. The picture you're looking at here shows you what a plaqued vessel looks like, an abnormal blood vessel. You can see where the white space is in that vessel. That's the space that's allowing blood to pass through it. And again, I have this blood vessel model here to show you normal and stages of plaquing. So you can see when you work your way up and down the right side picture of a blood vessel, stages of plaquing. That yellow is plaque. Okay. Next up, we're looking at the next level of development, or development of cardiovascular disease. And the worst picture or model is what you see here. Very little space for blood to move through that hole and opening, just like you see on the screen here. Here's a big plaque. And you can see it forming from an initial lesion or insult. Insult could be nothing more than, or as much of, it's a big deal, hypertension. Hypertension is chronically a bad thing for your blood vessels, and you end up with damage to the vessel wall. The vessel tries to stiffen to accommodate the higher pressure, and as a result you get this plaque formation. A fatty streak develops into a erythema mass, and then eventually into this large plaque. And if this plaque breaks free, well, that can invite embolisms in your respiratory tract and your brain. If that emboli breaks off and goes into a coronary vessel, it would cause that myocardial infarction. I did have a picture of it, even though I don't have a slide on it. You would get death of heart wall muscle as a result of a plaque or emboli forming in a coronary vessel. And this is going to help support your understanding of the cardiac lab.